Okay, so she can get it started, Dor. Thank you.
Hello. For those who don't know me, I'm Dor Abramson, member of faculty, Grad School of Education. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Tapan from the School of Information. Dr. Parikh received his Bachelor of Science in Molecular Modeling with honors from Brown University in 1996, where his thesis was on the perturbation dynamics of lactose-binding protein. Did I say that right?
I don't remember anymore.
Must mean something. He then moved to the West Coast and went on to receive in 1999 a Master's in Computer Science from the University of Washington, where he developed a compiler intermediate language with explicit support for representations. You know what that means? That's close already.
Yeah, a little bit, but still, in the past.
Finally, in 2007, still in UW, Dr. Parikh completed a doctoral dissertation on designing an architecture for delivering mobile information services to the rural developing world. In fact, designing technology for global development has been a theme of many of Tapan's projects over the last decade, including, and it was tough choosing among the many projects, Knowledge Network for Grassroots Innovators, Inspection, Monitoring and Quality Control for Rural Coffee Cooperatives, and Mobile Tools for Community Health Workers. TAP is considered a world leader and innovator who has reconceptualized a vision for how technology can empower disenfranchised communities. More recently, TAP has been designing technology also for local communities, such as East Bay Urban Youth, with the help of an NSF Cyber Learning Grant. And I'm guessing you might hear about more of that today?
Yeah, a little bit.
Great. For his ongoing creativity and excellence, Dr. Parikh has received numerous recognitions and awards, including Best Paper twice at CHI, which is the prestigious annual conference of ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery on Computer-Human Interaction. TAP is recipient of an NSF Career Award and recently a Sloan Fellowship. Way to go. TAP's courses over at the iSchool are invigorating and highly recommended if you can get into the waiting list. So please join me in welcoming Professor Parikh to the Grad School of Education.
Thanks, Dor. Well, thanks to all of you for the invitation. Thanks to Dor for suggesting me to give this talk. So, you know, as Dor said, I come from the School of Information. Before that, I come from a computer science background. But, you know, I've had the pleasure of working with numerous students here in the graduate school, or at least several students in the Graduate School of Education, and as well as coming to several of your talks, and so on and so forth. My wife asking me if I should buy these shoes for my son.
Mobile technology.
Put it on silent. So as I was saying, you know, I've had the opportunity to work with several students here in the Graduate School of Education, as well as be a part of a hiring committee with Dor, and have gone to many talks here. So as you'll see from my talk, study of education and more generally literacy and learning has been a recurring theme in a lot of my work, which I'm hoping to explore further through this new grant and through my collaborations with you students and faculty here in the Graduate School of Education. So all that to say, thank you for this invitation for building on existing bridges and building new ones as well. So my talk today is called Representation Technologies, and so Dor mentioned my master's thesis was on compiler representations. Here I'm going to be talking about a very different kind of representation for those of you who are familiar with compiler representations, which I'm guessing is probably not many of you. So, inside joke for non-computer science. And so, what do I mean by representation technology? So fundamentally, what my talk is going to be talking about is about inequality and technology, and more fundamentally about inequality in the internet, right? And so I'm going to start with this glib quote from a very well-known science fiction author, William Gibson. The future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And you know, nowhere is this more apparent than when we talk about internet or information technologies. And so here's a map of the world where each dot basically represents access to the internet, right? And participation on the internet more generally. So as we see, you know, there's just, you know, a lot of inequality, you know, largely along kind of traditional kind of economic indicators in terms of access and participation on the internet. And so this is basically what my work is going to try to address, to try to understand the source of some of this inequality and to address it through new kinds of technologies and as you'll see, programs, educational programs. So to summarize my talk, you know, in some sense, the motivation for my talk, representation technologies. You know, the internet serves as kind of a platform or a framework for mediating lots of very important relationships, whether it be political relationships, economic relationships, social relationships, educational relationships. Now, even if that's true, currently as the internet as it's designed is kind of proposed as this very egalitarian place, the source of freedom and equality for all. But really it's still a very unequal place, both in terms of access to the internet, but also in terms of the design of the technologies that we use to access the internet and the kinds of interaction and representations of knowledge that this design affords. And so the basic argument in this talk, which I'm going to pursue through a set of design experiments, is that we have to design for diversity. But diversity traditionally has been in terms of diversity in terms of users. I'm going to argue not only in terms of users, but also in terms of forms of knowledge and the kinds of infrastructure we use to access the internet. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that explore this theme. I'm going to start with a project called Awaz Day, which essentially proposes a new design for social media to support farmer-to-farmer knowledge sharing in rural India. Then I'm going to talk about a project called Local Ground, which rethinks kind of mapping and data skills from the context of youth learning data skills and being involved in projects within their communities. I'm going to close by talking about a course that Sapir, Sarah, and I taught last spring at Realm Charter School very briefly, a course called Design, Data, and Social Change, and some of the goals of this course and how we might take that work forward in the future. And finally, if there's time, which there may not be, I'll talk about a couple other projects I've done that have touched upon themes related to education. So I'm going to start with this project Awaz Day. And Awaz Day really is trying to address the inequality of participation on the internet, and fundamentally in terms of the kinds of content that's represented on the internet. And so this is a graphic produced by my colleague Mark Graham at the Oxford Internet Institute, where each of these squares represents user-generated content in Google. And so each of these squares you may not see is for a specific country. This is the United States, Germany, Canada, Netherlands, Japan. So if you look at this graph, you can see that there's a lot of content being generated by kind of traditional economic powers like the United States, Western Europe. But even if we look at countries with relatively large populations like China and India, here's China right here, I think India is one of these small squares over here, they're still lagging behind quite significantly when we talk about kind of participation on the internet, participation in terms of actually creating content that's indexed by Google and it becomes a part of this kind of global knowledge sphere that we all take for granted. So why is this inequality? What is the source of this inequality? Well, part of the question, part of the problem, as I showed you in the graphic earlier, is access. But even beyond that, there are questions related to the user interface in terms of how are these interfaces supporting not only consumption of content, but creation of content on the internet. And as I'll show, this has to do with questions related to literacy, language, all kinds of questions that we find important here. So to kind of investigate this question, I started with this kind of starting point in terms of thinking about small farmers in India. Small farmers are a really interesting community in the sense that not only do they have a lot of information needs and the requirements for information related to their agricultural practice, they're also rich sources of knowledge, drawing upon their own local experimentation, traditional knowledge bases that they've created through years and years of farming and sharing with their communities. So they could be potentially not only consumers of knowledge on the internet, but also great producers of knowledge for other people to find a benefit. So this is the basis for this project called Awaz Day, which means give voice in Hindi. This is a joint project. A lot of my projects are joint. In fact, all of them are joint with fantastic graduate students. This is a joint project with my former student, Neil Patel, who has since gone on to found a company based on the work that we did together. A lot of the projects we do are also, when we work internationally, they're also in partnership with local organizations, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, nonprofits, community-based organizations, who serve as kind of essential partners in both not only implementing and deploying technology, but also in the process of designing and conceptualizing it. So in this case, our partners were a local NGO called Development Support Center, DSC, which was a leading NGO in the state of Gujarat in India in the area of agricultural knowledge dissemination and sharing in training farmers and training agricultural extension staff. In popular NGO, one of the things they did was they ran a popular radio show on the local FM channel 15 minutes a week, which was very, very popular across the state, across the farmers of the state. One problem that radio show faced is that people wanted to interact with the on-air radio personalities. There were these two farmers who engaged in this kind of give and take throughout the show. And those personalities became so popular that farmers across the state wanted to interact with them. They wanted to ask them questions. They wanted to provide them their own, ideas. And so they wanted the idea, the kind of equivalent of a call-in radio show. So the DSC implemented a version of this. They left their cell phones on after the show, and they fielded about, phone calls for about 10 or 15 minutes. And so that served some of the kind of interactive goals of DSC and also the farmers who wanted to interact with these personalities. But then, we came in and we started thinking, how can we increase access to this kind of back and forth, wherein farmers are not only able to interact with these on-air radio personalities, but are also potentially able to interact with one another. So we started thinking about this, and there's lots of sites on the internet where we can have this kind of ability to interact with, potentially famous people, but also our peers, build kind of knowledge communities around topics of interest, in this case farming. So we thought, how can we do this in the case of small farmers in India? So one theory we were building on in doing this work was this kind of theory of orality and literacy that was proposed by Walter Ong through his years of work working with oral communities across the world. So what the basic premise of Walter Ong's work was that communities that are oral in their nature, like many of the farmers that we worked with, who are most comfortable accessing and sharing knowledge through spoken language, they all not only have different ways of accessing knowledge, but fundamentally different ways of representing and reasoning about that knowledge as well. So this is a theory that proposed that a lot of knowledge bases that are created through these kinds of means have different properties than the knowledge bases we're familiar with through more formal systems. So in one sense, they're aggregative, they're tolerant of repetition, redundancy, and inconsistency. One example of an aggregative knowledge base is kind of mythology. Mythology is a knowledge base that has many, many stories that has the same message or the same theme. In some cases, they can be complementary themes. In some cases, they may even be conflicting. But all of these stories build together to aggregate together to build kind of a larger knowledge base. And we aren't trying to kind of slice and dice into like a canonical set of themes or stories. Second, they're situational. They're stories that are created and referred to specifically by their connection to specific places, specific people, specific events. So they're not abstract in the sense they're describing kind of hypothetical or generalized scenarios, but they're tied to specific situations, specific people, and specific events. And lastly, they're dialectic. They're created and reinforced by a process of dialogue, through a process of conversation, question and answer, debate and discussion, right? And so there are a lot of, if you look at this as kind of a theory of knowledge creation and knowledge representation, there are a lot of oral knowledge bases on the internet, basically knowledge bases that are created through this process of discussion, conversation, and then exist later on for other people to refer back to. These are examples of these kinds of, oral knowledge bases according to this theory. So, if you look at sites like Quora or Facebook or various kinds of social media, all of them are essentially these kinds of knowledge bases. And so the question we had before us is, how do we adapt these kinds of systems to be appropriate for small farmers in India who might only be accessing the internet, if at all, through mobile phones, and who are most comfortable speaking in spoken language in their native language, right? And so how can we adopt this metaphor of social media to these kinds of user conditions? And so we designed a system that was essentially a voice-based discussion forum. And how it worked was, you called up a phone line, and the phone line had a call tree where you got a top-level prompt where you had the following message options. Some local music to liven things up, contextualize things as it were.
आप आवश्यक माहिती मेळववा માટે એક શબ્દ બોલો પ્રશ્ન પૂછવા માટે બોલો પ્રશ્ન માહિતી સાંભળવા માટે બોલો માહિતી રેડિયો કાર્યક્રમ સાંભળવા માટે બોલો રેડિયો.
So just like the options you would have when you call up, when you access like a mailing list or Quora or a discussion forum, you can post a new question. You can just skim through other people's questions and answers just to see if you can learn kind of serendipitously in that way. And finally, you can hear kind of a curated set of messages that are, like in some sense, the headlines or the news for your local area. So once they navigated this interface, they can choose to ask a question. The questions might be something like this, again, related to agriculture. I want to grow cotton. Which weather environment is best?
કપાસની ખેતી કરવી છે. કયું વાતાવરણ સારું પડશે?
So once a question is recorded, it gets stored by the system. And just like many social media systems, a very important role is played here by a person who serves as a kind of moderator. So in this case, the moderator plays a very important role, as they do in many online communities. And in this case, the moderator actually works for the NGO, in this case DSC, and because his job is so important. And so in this case, the moderator uses an interface, much like an interface we would use to browse our email, except all of the content is voice messages from this user community. And for each of the voice messages, the moderator is in charge of adding some metadata to the message that makes it easier to kind of index and search and filter later on. And so he puts in the name of the caller, the district, where they're calling from, and also puts in some information about the topic of the call, including the crop that it refers to and the specific topic related to that crop. And so this information is useful later on if a farmer calls in and says, I want to listen to all the questions related to cotton, or all the questions related to organic farming, for example. This information is also used to assign the question to a set of potential responders. And so in this way, this social network works in kind of a directed way, where there is a set of people registered in the system with specific kinds of expertise. Expertise in specific crops, specific categories of crops, specific topics, specific geographic regions. Now these may be people who work for the NGO, they work for DSC, or they may be people that are known to be lead experts or farmers in specific topics or specific areas, or they may just be people that have been identified through the system as having this kind of expertise. And so once a question is assigned to an expert, the expert gets a phone call on their phone, and they have the following options. One, they can listen to the message. Two, they can respond if they have an answer. And finally, three, they can forward the message if they think someone else might have a better answer. And so if they think the guy in the next village, or the person that works for the university, or the agricultural extension specialist in the area might have a better answer, they can forward it to them by just putting their phone number in there. And that way we also grow this kind of database of potential experts we have in the system, other people we could go to later on if another question comes up having to do with the same thing. And so once an answer has been generated, the original farmer gets a message on their phone, they get a phone call, they also get a text message that says they have a new answer and they can call back to retrieve that answer. And finally they can listen to that answer, they can respond, they may respond asking for some kind of clarifying information or asking for some further advice, or finally they might just say thank you for providing this information for me, just kind of continuing the dialogue and adding to the social capital. And finally they can save it. Saving is just a way of bookmarking that message so they can access it later on. So if they need to be able to refer back to it, they can save it as a way of giving them handy access to it. So this builds up kind of a database of questions and answers, that might be useful for other farmers later on. So other farmers can call in and, listen to all of the questions related to specific crops or specific topics or, that are relevant for their geographic area. The system can also broadcast these messages out. And so it can say, take this message that's been reported yesterday and broadcast it to all the users that are cotton farmers. And it's able to figure out who's cotton farmers based on some registration information or just based on who's asked some questions about cotton in the past, right? And so we build this kind of social media system that connects this kind of network of farmers with experts, builds that database over time, in a similar way that we see those kinds of knowledge creation processes on the internet, building kind of an aggregated knowledge base just out of these kind of question and answer kinds of processes. So in this way we get the equivalent of like voice threads. And so if you've seen a mailing, an email thread, this is the equivalent of a voice thread where you might have an initial question, an answer, another kind of follow-up from someone else who wanted more information or who wanted to provide their own kind of follow-up, and so on and so forth. We build up these kinds of asynchronous voice threads. And so this is a system we've been working on. By the way, feel free to ask questions at any point if they may. Yeah?
Is there an internet interface as well if someone wants to see a list of all the questions and answers?
Yeah, that's right. There's an internet interface as well. For the most part, the internet interface is used by the moderator to kind of selectively triage and filter the messages, because most of our users aren't quite on the internet yet, although they may be in the next few years. And so for the most part, it's only used by the moderator. But yeah, all of these messages are stored on the internet, and eventually it would be interesting to be able to expose a user interface through the internet as well. Yeah.
I don't know if you'll get to this now, but in terms of various ways of evaluating the system, for instance, do you know if people called in again?
Yeah.
You have a sense of loyalty to the system and how it is sort of distributed among peers?
No, that's a great question. We're tracking some of that, and I'll talk about some of the evaluations, but I'm sure there's room to do more with the data that we have. Yep. Any other questions? Yep.
I'm just curious about the average response time. So if I call in and ask a question, how long does it take for me to hear back?
Our goal is a day or two, right? Our goal is within 1 or 2 days. And so that's set essentially by policy within the organization. You know, the organization has a way. So I showed you the interface for the moderator, right? The moderator has another interface that's able to show them for all of the experts how many questions they have outstanding and how many of those they've responded to and their average kind of turnaround time. So that's their way of following up with the experts to make sure they're doing their job also in a timely way. Yeah. Great. So as Dora mentioned, you know, the key about this kind of intervention is to see what kind of impact is happening. You know, what's the impact on these new kinds of knowledge sources on the farmers' kind of daily practice. And so that, I'm going to talk about a couple of experiments we've done. So this system has been deployed since you know, sometime in late 2009. So it's been running for almost 5 years now. And so that's given us time to run a number of kind of experiments in situ, in the field, at relatively large scales. And so I'll talk about a few of those right now. So one thing that, for those of you who are kind of familiar with this, you know, there have been a number of other systems proposed to deliver agricultural information to farmers using mobile phones. You know, using text messages, using voice messages, using smartphone applications, et cetera, et cetera. What's really unique about this system we built, you know, besides being one of the first systems, was that it also supports kind of peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. You know, farmers are able to answer other farmers' questions, they're able to comment on them, they're able to listen to other farmers' questions, et cetera. And so ours was the first that really did that. And so, you know, one thing we wanted to understand is, you know, what is the impact? What's the demand of this kind of peer knowledge within this community? You know, is there really a demand for this kind of knowledge? Is there an impact of having access to this kind of knowledge? So that's one thing we look to understand through a controlled experiment. And so this is the basic research question that we set up. Is there greater demand for agricultural information from peers or from agricultural authorities, scientists, and so forth? Now, you know, traditionally when you think about agricultural extension systems, you know, agricultural extension, for those of you who don't know, the term is the term for the dissemination of kind of expert scientific agricultural knowledge to practitioner communities, farmers. And so within the world of agricultural extension, typically it's been a very top-down process where you have scientific institutes, universities, organizations, essentially disseminating knowledge through various kinds of mechanisms to farmers, right? And so there's been a lot of interest over the years in trying to make that process more participatory. You know, farming is recognized as an area where knowledge doesn't really only reside in these kind of top-down scientific institutions, but a lot of knowledge resides within the farmers themselves and within their own local communities, right? And so there's been a lot of interest in trying to make these kinds of knowledge systems more participatory over the time. And so this, you know, mobile phones provide us one opportunity to do that because it's a device that everyone, or lots of people, have access to, and they can use it not only to consume knowledge, as I mentioned, but also to create it and to share it. And so we wanted to see, you know, whether there's a real demand for this kind of knowledge within this particular ecosystem, and this deployment gives us kind of an empirical lens through which to do that. And so this is the research question we set up. We operationalized this experiment by essentially conducting a randomized experiment where we took 7 bits of content, 7 bits of agricultural content, agricultural tips, and we recorded them in 2 different voices. You know, one voice was retired agronomy professors, scientists, and one source were farmers from different districts in the state. And so each of these were recorded by both of these different sources, and then farmers received essentially a randomized combination of these different messages. And the messages look something like this. You know, the source would introduce themselves. Hi, I am Dr. X, a retired professor from Y University. If it was another farmer, they would say, hi, I am whoever I am, a farmer from X district, right? So they wouldn't have the doctor, and they would say that they were a farmer. And finally, there would be the content of the tip, and then after that, there would be a phone number where the farmer could call in for more information about that specific topic. And so this was essentially the behavioral measure, because to call this number back, they'd have to use their own airtime minutes to get that information. And so that was an indicator of whether or not they really cared about the message enough to follow up and receive this additional information. And so we conducted this through a kind of a randomized experiment where each participant received a sequence of 7 messages with a combination of sources, and essentially measured the follow-up rate. How often did they follow up with when each of these sources was the source of the message. And so what we found was the follow-up rate was significantly higher when the source was a peer as opposed to when it was a scientist, a retired agronomy professor. So this is interesting. It showed, again, validated our initial hypothesis that there is this kind of demand for this peer knowledge within the network.
Did the local peer read the same text?
Same exact text, yeah.
Like word for word?
Yep. Yep. And we controlled in the text to make it equally plausible to be coming from either source. So it was written in kind of layman's terms in some sense. Yeah. And so this is an interesting finding because whenever we went and spoke to farmers personally, they always told us, oh, we want to get information from scientists, only universities, only the best knowledge for us. But when we actually ran this controlled experiment, we found that there was significantly more follow-up when the source was a peer as opposed to when this source was a retired professor. There goes my retirement plans.
Is the follow-up supposed to go directly to that person? I mean, is there like an intimidation?
It's not expressly stated as such, but it's implied. It's not expressly stated that you'll get the same person, but it's implied that that's what's going to happen. But that's a good question. There might have been some confusion about that. So, what are some explanations for this observation? So one is, it could be a biased sample. All of these people were prior users of this system, and so maybe they had just gotten used to peer knowledge, and now they had gotten so used to it that they wanted it. There could have been some solidarity effect where if the source is another farmer, they just wanted to show that they're a part of the club, and they wanted to give them some sense of support by calling back. On the other hand, when we spoke to farmers and they told us all they wanted was information from scientists or experts, there could have been some perceived social desirability in giving us that response because we're perceived as experts, we're perceived as scientists, and so maybe they were just telling us what we wanted to hear. So that's another possible explanation, and so maybe there's some real reason to support this kind of peer knowledge sharing. Yep.
Well, interesting question is it the identification of the speaker or the actual voice? In other words, if you have the same person identifying himself as a farmer, and then that's the same person as an expert, and see if that affected the results.
Yeah, no, that'd be interesting. So I think you could also vary the voice. You could actually vary the content also. So there's lots of interesting follow-up experiments that one might do. And you might also look at beyond just the follow-up rate. You might actually look to how much of that advice was actually implemented on people's farms, right? Because that'd be an even stronger measure of how much they were valuing that information. Yeah.
I have a question. The number, the callback number, would they have an actual interactive conversation when they call back, or just for additional mechanical?
More mechanical information, yeah.
Okay.
Although I'm guessing the first time they called back, they didn't know what they were in for. But
I think that makes a difference.
possibly. So another interesting thing that we saw was, another measure that we used is on the last call. So 7 calls went like this. The last call, went like this, but then the prompt was, please hold and you'll be connected to someone to talk more about this, right? And so that please hold, we did a really dirty trick. It held interminably. We just measured how long people were willing to be on hold for. And so what we found was people waited on hold longer if they were expecting to speak to a scientist as opposed to speaking to a peer, right? And so maybe that also means something else. Were they valuing the scientist's time more? And if they were going to hold, they decided to hold all the way through. So yes, I think there's still a number of things to tease apart to really figure out what's going on here. Yeah.
Related, is the peer somebody they might actually know?
Probably not, because this is like a statewide sample, and the peers were chosen, pretty randomly geographically, and so, on balance, it's pretty unlikely that they knew who that peer source was. Yeah.
Is there a chance that the information in that first response would be enough to answer their question?
There is a chance, and that might lead to no follow-up at all. Yeah. But it was designed, this is a dirty experiment, but in the sense that, we were, manipulating a bunch of things. It passed IRB, to be clear. But one thing was that those tips were designed to be teasers. They were designed to be something that kind of whetted the appetite to learn more. It was kind of like those BuzzFeed headlines, right? 15 things you want to know about Michael J. Fox or something. I don't know. It's a little digging right out of it. Right there. Anyway, they're designed to be like these teasers. Yeah. Any other questions? So these are all. I think there's a lot more work to be done here to really tease apart where this kind of difference comes from. Is it because of the voice, as someone mentioned? Is it because there's a presumption of better information coming from one source or another? And so one thing we did is we conducted some follow-up interviews just to see what were people thinking when they were making these choices, right? And so when we asked people why they called back when there was a scientist on the line, we kind of got these normative explanations. Well, this is a scientific age, and old farming techniques have become obsolete. So if you listen to scientists, there's something bad going on, I think, with this. I'm not sure if you want to turn that off. So if we listen to scientists, we will progress. So kind of a normative argument. Science is good. Follow science, right? But when we asked about why they were following more calling back in the case of other farmers, we got these kind of detailed explanations of why farmers have better knowledge in some situations, right? So advice from farmers is important as they have local information. Different areas have different crops, so local experience is important. Scientists take a long time to do things. Newsflash door. Farmers have experiences every 10 to 15 days that they can talk about. Scientists take longer to spread, so on and so forth, right? And so they're giving really detailed explanations as to why they might value this information from their peers more than they might value that same information coming from agricultural experts, right? So this is more evidence that there is actually this pent-up demand for this peer information, and that we should design our agricultural extension systems, and by translation, our kind of technology-mediated extension systems to account for peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. So this is one of the things that we see as our kind of design contribution to this space of technology-mediated agricultural extension, and I think eventually translating to other domains, is that one should design systems in such a way to support the kind of peer-to-peer knowledge sharing that we find so valuable on the internet. It's not enough to just build these kind of top-down information channels. So another thing we've been doing is we've been conducting, actually, again, speaking to some of Dora's questions around evaluation, we've been conducting a larger scale randomized control trial in RCT into the impact of this system on actually things like farmers' income and yields and decision making. And so we have a randomized trial going on with 1,200 farmers. I actually think this has been scaled up to 5,000 farmers now. And out of these, we've been running this, we're just reaching the end of the experiment. In fact, I think the experiment has ended and we're just tabulating the final data from it. We haven't tabulated the final data, but halfway through, this is the data that we obtained. 58% have called, 32% have asked a question, and 16% have answered. And so you see most people are using the service, most people are actually contributing to it, and some are even answering it. A significant fraction are actually participating in a peer-to-peer way in terms of answering other farmers' questions. In terms of decision making, farmers who have been given access to this service are more likely to follow the kinds of advice that's being disseminated through it, and so that's showing that it is having an impact on things like decision making. And so through the service, we were sending out information related to a more appropriate pesticide for the variety of cotton people are growing in that region. That also happens to be less environmentally degrading, and a majority of the farmers that have been treated have been using this pesticide as opposed to the ones who haven't, who aren't aware of it. And for most of the people who are regularly using this service, it's become their kind of most important information source, displacing other information sources like the local pesticide vendor, input supplier, community members, et cetera, et cetera. So it has definitely had an impact on things like decision making and farmer knowledge. So on the other hand, there are still some limitations. 58% have used it, which means 42% haven't. We're not sure what's going on there. They've been given access to it. They've been actually subsidized access to it, and so it's not clear whether or not using it. Even with all of these designed to try to make the system more accessible to all ranges of education and literacy, it still turns out that the more educated a farmer is, the more likely they are to use this service and to benefit from it. And so that's still a concern. There is this still digital divide, no matter how you might design things. On the other hand, decision making is not affected by education, and so all of the people who have been given access to it, whether or not they have a certain level of education, they're still following the advice that's being disseminated through the service. Finally, one thing that we are finding is that the kind of information we're disseminating through this service, it also comes with not only what to do, but why to do it. What's the mechanism for doing that? And we're finding out that people are following the advice, but they're not necessarily learning why they're following that advice. And so it seems that for the most part, people are still following this advice by rote, as opposed to understanding what and why they're doing it. So this is some things to work on for the future. So we get a lot of positive feedback. The service has been going on for 4 or 5 years now. We have a regular user base of something like 15 or 20,000 farmers who regularly subscribe. And so we get a lot of positive feedback, makes the day job worthwhile, things like this. Congratulations to Abadodlo, I'll forever be in your debt. This is, I pray to God that you keep offering it. I can just sit at my house, ask a question, and I get an answer. That's kind of easy for us to reason about, but for farmers in India, it's a new thing, and so they're really excited at this convenience. And finally, big up, now I have another question, right? So it shows, maintaining that social capital, realizing that this is a worthwhile thing, and you want to keep using it while it's there. Yep.
Earlier you used the term community to speak about what some might say the clients out there. And I was wondering if how you perceive this construct of community. Is that something that one uses in a facile way, or do you mean like there was some sense of community built up between people who had not known each other, or it's about identity, or what?
Yeah, no, I think, it's just like a lot of other online communities where, there's a spectrum of how much that term is really appropriate for what you're describing, and in this case, I think over the years, we really have seen a community grow up around this service. I didn't talk about these results here, but in kind of in our initial pilot study that we ran in 2009, we saw a lot of things like kind of self-moderation, and so if users were using the system inappropriately, other farmers would call them on it. So there was one farmer who was trying to sell a product on the line. He was like, buy this thing from me. And other farmers were like, listen, this is not for selling things, it's for asking and answering questions. And so we saw these kinds of self-moderation going on. We also saw a lot of back and forth in terms of farmers asking other farmers questions, answering other farmers questions. Now, definitely, I think we see this kind of formation of a community, but I think the other interesting thing we found is that there are actually design levers that you can turn to change the kind of characteristics of that community that are interestingly related to things like not only design features, but also to the economics of the system and how you sustain it. And so one thing that we did over time is that we've moved from a free model to kind of a freemium model to like a subscription-based model. And so initially, farmers accessed the system for free. They had free airtime. Everything was subsidized. Now, they have a certain amount of time that they can use the system freely. But then, if they want to call back and if they want to, start participating more actively, like listening to all of the messages and answering everyone else's messages, well, then they'll start incurring airtime to do that. And one thing that we find is that going from this kind of free model to this kind of subscription-based model, we lose a lot of those kind of social peer-to-peer effects. Now people see the system much more transactionally, like it's a place for me to get my questions answered, as opposed to a place where I can really learn from others and answer their questions and so on and so forth. And so, one thing that people have been talking about is that we're going to see all the things we see here on the internet happen all over the world, once they get access, right? But what that doesn't really recognize is that we grew up, many of us, and continue to grow up in a world of very cheap, unlimited airtime for data. And even for those people who are transitioning to internet database services, they're still paying per the bit, for a lot of those services. And so what will that say about the kinds of social interactions, knowledge bases, that we'll see created on the internet in some of these countries? Well, I think the jury's still out. Any other questions? Yeah?
Did anybody become more popular as a question answer? Did you get
like internet fame?
Yeah.
Celebs.
Internet celebs? Yeah, I think we definitely saw some examples of people. In fact, some of the most active users of this site were people who are like relatively young, very ambitious, very dynamic, creative, really took a lot of interest in farming, were like deep into it, but just happened to be from a remote place. And so, we just saw several examples of these kinds of users become really the power users of our system, right? And so, yeah, I think that's the kind of thing you see, because people who would have been in more populous, population centers have kind of other outlets for their social network and for building their social capital and for increasing their sphere of influence. And for people from remote areas, they saw this really as a vehicle for doing that. Is that true for the internet? Do we see more YouTube videos from Iowa? Sorry, I was from Iowa.
So my best friend.
Yeah.
Did the university experts see like a big benefit from it? I mean, did they learn from like the local farmers anything? I mean, like kind of did they have?
That's a great question. We didn't try that experiment. We didn't have them look through the content here and see what they got out of it. No, we haven't done that exact experiment yet. That's a good question. I'd be interested to see if they could turn this around. Yeah. Yep.
Are there different ethics issues for doing, say, the experiment in India versus, say, the United States? For example, like misidentifying the source of information. You think that would be acceptable in the United States as opposed to doing it in India?
I think it would be. I mean, we were very careful about those kinds of things. Even where those tips were, we were very careful to make sure all of those were actually good advice, regardless of what the source was. And so I think we tried to kind of uphold kind of ethical principles in terms of treatment of subjects and so on and so forth. But I don't know if I were to, propose doing the same thing with, let's say, for example, a health intervention, with domestic low-income populations. That's a good question. Any other questions? All right. So I'm going to move on now. So one thing I should mention. Oh yeah, this is. So here, here's one example of self-moderation in the site. Oh, and we turned off the audio. Sorry. Self-moderation. So here's something we got on the site. So this is a song that we got. One of the farmers decided to record this folk song, and he recorded actually 6 different versions of this song, on the site. So other farmers were listening, hearing 6 different versions of this song. And so the other farmers were like, at first were like, wow, that's cool, it's got a beat, And they were like, that's twice, that's 3 times. They were like, you're wasting everyone's airtime, They were like, no more singing on the site. And then, eventually we set up our own, singing site separately, so to serve that audience with what they were demanding. So, one thing we've done is we've, once we've had this site going for a few years, we've translated it into a startup company which offers this as a kind of hosted commercial service for any organization who wants to set up these kinds of question and answer or voice portals. And so initially we started in agriculture, but now we've got sites that are used for lots of different applications, including for things like health or for increasing labor transparency or for...
Is that Sesame Street?
That is Sesame Street, yeah. That's the Indian version of Sesame Street. And so they were using it for a site where they've got this kind of project where they give essentially educational workers this kind of toolkit of like Sesame Street or Gully Gully Sim Sim branded materials. And so they go from slum to slum and they essentially run small classes. And so they were using it as a way for all of their kind of educational workers to connect to one another and to send them updates and create a community of those users. So for things like microfinance and all different things. And actually one of our most promising kind of use cases at this point is essentially a service to help teachers stay connected with parents of the kids who go to school. And so for lots of kind of urban areas, semi-urban, rural areas, one of the main things to make sure of is the kids go to school. And so this is a service to allow teachers to set up essentially mailing lists to connect with their parents of kids who go to school. So things like this. So lots of different use cases have come up, and we're continuing to work on them. Okay, so I talked about rethinking social media to farmer-to-farm knowledge sharing, and now I'm going to talk about local ground, rethinking mapping for youth learning data skills. And so we talked about content. Another kind of content is maps. And so this is the, oh wait, this is the wrong slide. This is the wrong slide. So another kind of content is maps. And so if you think about maps on the internet, you know, Google Maps, OpenStreetMaps, a lot of areas are covered, but still a lot of areas fundamentally aren't. And when we go beyond things like roads and topography and just talk about things like local businesses, local establishments, perceptions of the local people, places of interest, et cetera, there's large parts of the world that are still relatively unmapped when it comes to these kinds of data sources. And so, on the other hand, you know, when we actually go and visit these communities, there's a lot of rich knowledge that is already embedded in paper maps. And so this is a community that Sarah, who's in the audience, visited in Ethiopia. It's an agricultural community, and when she visited this community, you know, when she talked to the planners, people in charge, agricultural ministry, they all said that they don't have very much information about what's going on in those areas in terms of what people are planting, how people are using the land, what are important resources. And when Sarah went to actually visit these communities, she found that there's a lot of knowledge already represented in these rich local maps that are often put into community centers, farmers clubs, et cetera, that had all this detailed knowledge about how land was being used, important local resources, and so on and so forth. And so that inspired this project called Local Ground, Map Locally, Visualize Globally. So the idea here is how can we take some of this knowledge that's represented in rich kind of forms and make it more available for online representation. So this is Sarah's project. I guess I don't need her picture because she's right there, but now you get a dog. And so, yeah, that's got to be embarrassing when you're in the room, right? And it's also, again, with a number of partners across the Bay Area, we've been working on this. And so this is a problem we first observed in Ethiopia. Then when we came back to the Bay Area, Sarah recognized that this is a problem also locally. And we talk about cities like Berkeley, Oakland, Richmond, and youth. You know, there's a lot of voices that are fundamentally not represented, not only in mapping, but all kinds of local urban issues, civic issues, local debates. And so we thought about how can we include these voices in the planning process. So here we're building on a set of ideas that were first introduced to me by Dor, but must be very familiar to a lot of you in the educational school, the work of Andy DeSessa, where we're talking about meta-representational competence. And so here, you know, the kind of theory that I want to build upon for this project is, you know, when we're talking about youth, thinking about kind of issues within their own communities and their own neighborhoods that they can document and observe, you know, how are they going to represent that knowledge? You know, what are the different ways that they're going to represent it? What representational forms are they going to choose? And how are they going to choose different forms when they actually have to argue for specific points of view or perspectives when they go to formal contexts like the town hall meeting, or to make a presentation to a scientific body, or to planners, et cetera, et cetera. And so how do youth decide how to represent these kinds of empirical phenomena, and to which representations do they use for different purposes, you know, for making decisions amongst themselves, for advocating for their viewpoint with other audiences, et cetera. So often, you know, this is a process of kind of conversion of data, and we all do this ourselves, you know, conversion of data from these kind of rich, tacit formats that are based on our direct observation to other formats that may be easier to aggregate, visualize, analyze, compare, filter, and maybe more canonical from the perspective of decision making and planning. So this is the basic kind of process we're trying to support. You know, this kind of scientific process of going from observations, structuring those observations, visualizing that structure, interpreting those visualizations, and then using those interpretations to communicate your perspective to different audiences, including yourselves. So how do we support this process? Well, I'll talk about each step through kind of a small case study. So the first step is just observation, and for that I'm going to talk about planning a local park. And so this is a project we did with the Y Plan, the Center for Cities and Schools here on campus, and Kennedy High School in Richmond. And so this is a 10th grade class, 11th grade class, right? And so the first step, you know, for what we were working on, the context we were working on was a new urban revitalization effort, nicer urban revitalization effort that actually just recently completed, right? Yeah. And so this was a number of years ago where they were talking about redeveloping this park, this housing development, and this school. And our goal was to see how youth voices could be involved and included in this planning process. And so the first thing that we did was just involving youth in observing what was going on in these spaces right now. And to do that, we sent youth out with these paper maps where they could take notes and make drawings, also digital cameras that they could use to take pictures. And they used those to kind of just document what they were seeing in those spaces right now. And so the paper maps came back looking something like this, with a lot of annotations all over them about how these spaces were being used, what they saw as the use of these kinds of spaces. And so here you see some of these kinds of annotations. And one thing that Local Ground can do is that it allows us to kind of scan or take a picture of these maps and then overlay them all together on top of Google Maps. And so this allows us to combine all of these different kinds of data sources coming from youth into like kind of one very complicated view on the space. And so here you can see some annotations on the school ground, some pictures, some drawings, I love swimming. And so getting back to this kind of idea of representation, one thing that you'll see here is a lot of cupcakes, cupcakes all over. It took us a while to figure out that these were cupcakes, but eventually we found out that these were cupcakes, right? So there's cupcakes all over this school ground. What do you think that might mean? Why are there cupcakes? Some of you have seen this talk before, so I'll ask you to hold your opinions. Anybody? Yep.
I'm guessing it's a euphemism for something else.
That's true. It is a euphemism for something else.
Yes, something else that is consumed, maybe not too legally.
I think it's legally consumed, although there's a gray area here.
I think public consumption is the word. Well, I don't know. Anyways.
So Dora has anticipated what's going to happen next. So it wasn't illegal as such, but it may have been, let's say, controversial. So cupcaking was within that school, it was the term for making out. Right, and so these were all places where it seemed to be a good spot for doing that, right? So again, kids are using their own colloquial forms to represent these kinds of phenomena that are going. And how did we find that out? Well, we had no idea. We had to go back and show these maps to kids and be like, why are there so many cupcakes? How did this happen? How did this actually play out?
I actually don't remember, but it's definitely something that I was informed of.
Someone shyly
pulled to the side and like, hey.
For the purpose of the story, someone shyly raised their hand and said, let's make it out. So again, we see and then we're able to if we take everybody's map, we can see kind of clusters or hot spots, quote unquote, areas where we see more cupcakes rather than less, right? And so, again, we're seeing, how this rich local knowledge is bubbling up, as it were, through these kinds of representations. We got a lot of other kinds of information besides just the making out. There are areas that need trees, somebody's house, pointing to the Nystrom Village Community Center, that's where it is. In parenthetical, not very welcoming, Someone else pointed to the same place and said it looks like a crack house, and so, again, we're getting a lot of rich local perspectives on what was going on in different spaces around the park. We were also able to combine this kind of drawings with pictures and other kinds of qualitative data. So here is a picture of right across the street from the park, the methadone clinic where a bunch of people are lined up in the morning. And so the students use this picture as evidence that it may not be such a great idea to put the playground right across the street from here. So again, use of different representations of data to make their point, in this case a picture. And so that's the first step in the process, just observing what's going on in these spaces and using all of these rich qualitative ways of describing those observations. So the next step is to kind of create some structure to this data. So how do we go from just these qualitative data, rich, first-hand, direct observation, to actually structuring the process of creating a database, creating elements in that database that we can combine, compare, aggregate, visualize, filter, right? And so to talk about that, I'm going to talk about another project we did, verifying grocery stores. This was with Oakland Unified School District, an organization called iSeed, and then also Castlemont High School, a number of kids from Castlemont High School in East Oakland. And so here what we did was we started out this map of where all the purple dots, this is the data set we got from the County of Alameda Department of Corporations. And all of these purple dots essentially refer to what the Department of Corporations thinks are grocery stores in Oakland. And so when we showed this map to the kids from Castlemont, they were like, no way. You know, there's no way there's that many grocery stores in our neighborhood, right? And so they designed their own kind of data collection instrument, you know, in this case a map plus a survey that they could use to go and ground truth this data. So they visited each of these grocery stores, they took down some data about each of those stores, the name of the store, a rating, category, some notes. They came back, collected all this data, they digitized it using an interface that we provide in local ground so that this data becomes a structured database that they can later use to query and filter. And then they built their own visualizations that categorized the stores according to what they thought of them as. And so here, you know, all the colored stores are the stores that they actually visited in their area. The green stores are actually grocery stores. The pink stores they categorized as convenience stores or corner stores. The red stores are liquor stores. Blue is other. Blue is specialty store, right? And also in terms of their qualitative rating, positive, neutral, negative. So this gives kind of a youth perspective on this kind of data set that was being provided by the county. And so, again, they were able to combine this data, not only have it in kind of a structured format, to also combine it with rich qualitative data that they obtained in these same places. And so I'll show you some of the pictures and audio that they collected.
How was it when you went inside?
It was dirty when I went inside, and I would never eat anything in there.
Do you consider this to be a grocery store?
Hell no.
Why?
Because they don't sell any groceries, and it's just a bunch of junk food in there.
It just came out of like a supermarket. It was called Gonzalez, and I liked it. I felt like everything was organized, and it was nice, and I saw like the workers fixing everything that were like out of place.
It's alcohol and stuff, but it's not like, oh, hell alcohol. It's like, you know, they have their one little section as if you were in a regular store.
So again, you see, you know, how this qualitative data, you know, provides more depth and richness to just the kind of categorical indicators that they developed in the first part of this exercise, right? And so you can imagine, again, you know, going back between these different representations of their observations could be useful in different ways in different contexts, right? Within the class, for kind of refining their categories, discussing, you know, what signifies what, you know, what are important, you know, health concerns for our neighborhood, and so on and so forth. But also for external audiences and external contexts, where they can use these kinds of evidence to justify their findings, to provide more kind of emotional impact from their presentations, and so on and so forth. So, you know, as a research question, we're really interested in thinking about how youth decide when to use different kinds of representations of their own first-hand empirical knowledge, but also how we can facilitate their learning the appropriateness of these different representations for different tasks that they might want to perform, not only related to kind of argumentation and deliberation, but also for different kinds of processing related to things like aggregation, comparison, filtering, querying, comparisons, etc. So the next step from this, as I started to show in the last thing, is to just think about kind of how we might visualize this data and how that might lend itself to different kinds of analyses and sense-making activities. And for that, I'll talk about a third project, looking at air quality in the BART network. And so here, this is a project that we did with the Lawrence Hall of Science eBay's project, East Bay Academy for Young Scientists, and also with the West Oakland Air Quality Indicators Project. Is that right? Yeah. So these two groups we were working with here in the context of a summer program. And here we equipped youth with these particulate matter sensors that were able to essentially measure the air quality across the entire BART network. And so here's some of the data that they found. This is just a spatial map that overlays their findings in the network. And so red is where there were potentially some trouble spots. But then they also generated some custom visualizations like this with the help of Sarah and our developers, where they overlaid a time series on Street View so that they actually can see where that data was generated from, try to make hypotheses about what they might be seeing based on the physical and environmental characteristics of those locations, right? So again, another visualization that helps them both make sense of their findings and potentially also communicate it to different audiences. So, you know, one of the things that they found was that the air quality was much worse in a lot of the underground stations, particularly Embarcadero, when compared to some of the above ground stations, in this case Pittsburgh. And so here you can see a clip of the students explaining their findings.
get stuck in traffic. They're moving, and all the wind that is caused by it just takes all like the dust with it. Most of bad people.
Pittsburgh, the reason why it was so low is because Pittsburgh is right next to the water. So the water helps to maneuver the PM to go to different places.
So again, one thing you'll see in these kinds of audio quotes is that students are referring to all different kinds of sources of knowledge, different representations of their empirical finding, to try to make sense of what's going on. And that's again the process we're trying to follow and observe, is how do they use all of these different representations in different ways to help them understand, discuss, and communicate what they're observing to different kinds of audiences. So here you see all the different kinds of representations that they had of this basic thing. And here is the same students talking about the importance of this process and why it matters.
You cannot make a change if you don't know there's a problem. So therefore you have to recognize it and allow others to acknowledge it. So therefore the process of coming up with a solution can be possible. A lot of people in California have asthma, and it's really bad because it can kill you. So that's our whole point of doing this research, because we want to inform the people who have asthma and to let them know exactly what they're breathing in, and try to help them fix it by talking to the BART station. You can actually tell if they listen to what you were saying, and if the decrease, you know that they changed something about the BART system. But if it increased, that means you have to keep bugging them until they change it.
So again, it shows that this kind of process is not only important, this kind of learning process is not only important from building kind of students' core STEM capabilities, but also increasing their kind of active participation within their communities, their civic agency, becoming more informed kind of participants in the democratic process, as it were. So, one of the things that resulted from this particular project was that the findings from the students was actually written up by the Huffington Post, and they ended up having a meeting with the BART public relations authorities, several meetings in fact, as I'm led to understand. And so this is still an active topic of conversation between the youth and various kinds of media outlets and the public authorities. So the next step, this gets to the next step of this process, which is really to take these kinds of findings, all the things you've made sense of, both through your empirical research and through discussions within your classroom and group, to essentially communicate those findings to different kinds of audiences. And for doing this, talking about this, I'm going to go back to the first project that we did, where we were talking about kind of urban planning. And in the context of that project, the class came up with this really nice mock-up of what they'd like to see in this park. A graffiti wall, a running track, walking tracks, a pond. And then they presented this vision along with their supporting evidence at a town hall meeting. And so this is a video from that meeting.
There's the Eastern Village, and then there's Electrical between it. There's the busy street. And so if you had like a snappy word in the community, it would prevent people from walking across the street where it's unsafe.
Right here, right here. I think it was better stacked up because it shows everybody and it shows like more artistically.
I like that though, I mean, it gives you a sense of the complexity of the place, multi-layered, and there's all kinds of different things that you have to take into consideration.
You gotta love when the guy in the suit reads his lines right on cue, Mike Ford. Anyway. So again, that shows, how another thing we're interested in seeing is how students are able to use these kind of tools as a way of communicating their viewpoints, their perspectives to different audiences in ways that are convincing and are consistent with their own experience and ways of representing their knowledge. So some things we've learned through this process, well, one thing we found is that, a lot of times instead of paper, you might want to go out and collect data using, handheld devices, PDAs, mobile devices, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we looked at early on is to, support these other ways of collecting data, through paper, through digital cameras, and so one thing that we found is that, using these kinds of, one might say, kind of low-tech approaches to collecting data can also reduce some of the distractions in the classroom, and we've seen some findings from some of our other groups looking at similar kinds of approaches where they've used mobile phones, where those mobile phones essentially become a distraction for students because they're spending most of their time texting or sending emails or whatever they're doing instead of looking at what they're supposed to be looking at. Also, this kind of open-ended data collection format. If you're talking about collecting data using phones, you're already decided to have a specific kind of survey instrument or form that you're using to collect your data, as opposed to these kinds of open-ended data collection formats like drawings and pictures, which especially for the early stages of inquiry where you're still trying to figure out what questions to ask and what matters and what one should be looking at, these kinds of technologies can really support that process much more effectively than just collecting structured data. Finally, I think, this idea of, actually converting these kinds of analog representations, direct first-hand observations, into a format that can be hosted online, stored online, overlaid on Google Maps, from the student's perspective, actually increases the credibility of that knowledge. And so one quote that we have heard is that now our data is on Google, right? And so in some sense that matters. It becomes more meaningful now that it's online, now that it can be visualized in that way. And finally, I think one thing we're really interested in looking at is, how is data a part of the political process? And how can we empower youth to use data in ways that advances their political vision and ideals? And I think that's something we're still very interested in looking at. These are some future research questions. I can kind of skip this because I think we've talked about this a lot already. But getting back onto this agenda of involving students more in their communities through these kinds of activities. I mentioned Sarah, Sapir, and I, we taught a class at Realm Charter School at the 10th grade level last spring, which was titled Data, Design, and Social Change. And we used local ground in this class, but we also used a number of other tools and approaches, trying to find ways that we can use both data in the sense of kind of data analysis and visualization, but then also design in the sense of problem solving, prototyping, et cetera, as a way of engaging students in local social and civic issues. And so in the class, we did projects with the students on understanding and addressing educational inequality, and also on new urban transportation alternatives. And so this is a really exciting class. And I think if we kind of pop up one level, what we're really thinking about is thinking about alternative ways for students to engage with computing and computing-related skills, broadly in the STEM disciplines. And to do this through kind of more motivating, familiar, and real-world contexts, which provide a kind of contextualization of these skills in ways that are more meaningful to students, seem more directly relevant to their current situations, but then also prepare them for pursuing those careers in the long term and developing those skills in a way that are professionally credible. And so how can things like data collection, analysis, and visualization, prototyping, and design connect these skills to locally relevant social and civic issues is really what we're thinking about through this work. Okay, so I've talked about this, I've talked about this, I've talked about this. I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about this, so I'll just briefly show you some pictures. We made a vending machine to crowdsource the grading of CS exams, if you're interested in that. Basically paid undergrads that were loitering in the hallway in Sodal Hall with candy to grade other students' exams. So, you may or may not think that's a good idea. And so another project we did was, so in the developing world, but especially elsewhere, a common situation is multiple kids sharing one computer. And then one thing we did was to connect multiple mice to that computer. So originally, that was done by Microsoft Research. They just connected all the mice to the computer. But what that would result in is basically a click race. The kids would race to see who would click first on everything, right? And so no one learned anything because it was just like, how fast can you click? And so we designed this kind of new operating system layer that essentially created a thing called MetaMouse. And so it didn't allow the students to click until they agreed on a location. And that was implemented at kind of the operating system level, which meant you could use this multi-mouse approach now with any existing educational content. And so it worked kind of like this, you'd have to convince the other people that what you were saying was a good idea. They'd all have to move their mouse there, and only then could you actually click on that thing. And so one thing that we were able to show is that this actually potentially made this even better than just a single user, single mouse situation, because now you had to talk to the other people in your group before you made any decisions, and you actually had to have a discussion around it. And so it turned out this, in some cases, even fostered more discussion and more deliberation and more learning than just a single user with a single mouse. So yeah, that's a. Oh, here's some data.
Can I ask a
Yeah.
question about the MetaMouse? Did you try it just with kids that sit together next to one screen, or also maybe in different rooms?
I'm sorry, as an experiment?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the conditions would be just MetaMouse versus multiple people sitting in front of the same machine. I can't remember if that was a condition or if it was just one user, one mouse. I'll have to go back and look. That would be a good thing to look at. And what in different rooms you mean they'd have some kind of chat channel or back
there
channel?
are many programs where people can collaborate on a project, but not really that your what you create depends on the other person taking.
Right.
Where they sit in different rooms.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Maybe that there could be a virtual back channel that gives you some of the same properties. Yeah, we haven't looked. Yeah, we haven't tried some of those. In this case, I think the only conditions we tried was MetaMouse versus the race mouse versus which is obviously better than, and then just a single user, single mouse condition. But I can't remember if there were more than one people who each of those. I would try to give you a theme that connected to all those projects, but I don't think I can. So these are just other education projects. And that's it. That's my talk. So there's some URLs and links. Thanks to Tapan, thanks to Sarah, who are here in the audience, and everyone else in my group.
We have a few minutes for 2 questions.
Yeah.
I guess it's probably still a bit early in the day to speak about this question, but do you have a sense of trajectories of participants in your project? Like, were they more likely to do this or that, or what was the long-term impact of this?
Well, so here's the thing. I'm assuming you're talking about our local ground project.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
Yeah. So I think so far a lot of that has to do more about kind of the surrounding context as opposed to the technology. So it's more about the educational programs that the technology is embedded in, right? And so, for example, I mentioned the eBase project, that we were supporting using this technology, and I think they've, I think they're tracking that kind of data, and I think, at least anecdotally from a few kind of individual observations, the kids that are in their programs are doing really, really fantastic and going on to really interesting things post high school. I don't know, how true that is across the board, or how systematically they're collecting that kind of data. But I think whatever effect we're seeing is much more due to the kind of educational program as opposed to the use of this kind of specific technology. Which is why I think, because we're interested in kind of that holistic kind of understanding of what contributes to those kinds of outcomes, is part of the reason that we've gone from working through existing partners and existing organizations to start developing some of our own, including this class that we taught. That class continued in the summer program that Sarah ran last summer here, and now we're talking about continuing this as an after-school program here on campus, so that we can have kind of more freedom and flexibility in designing appropriate educational programs that I think optimally leverage these kinds of technologies. Sarah, do you know about is there any systematic evaluation going on in any of the projects that we?
I think there is, but some of them are anonymized, but there are other actually graduate students at the School of Education who are tracking some of this. I mean, not necessarily with local grant, but
yeah.
with some of the others.
I think we might have Victor Diaz come here later in the year. So he's the principal at Rel. So
yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, they're doing more in the kind of education and technology space, as I understand. It's a fertile ground for trying new things. Yeah.
Do you all have plans of engaging math and science teachers and learning how to use Common Ground in their classrooms, or is that something that you guys are?
Oh, we'd love to do that. In fact, we've tried as part of the good.
Yes, solicitation.
No, we would love to do that. In fact, we're this is we're in the second year of a 3-year grant with this project. For the most part, we've worked with after-school, summer kinds of programs. We started working with in the classroom last fall, and we tried to get a project off the ground. But at the same time, the school also implemented a new math curriculum around Common Core, And so all the teachers are super busy with that, and so we weren't able to get a lot of their time to work on this. And so we're trying again this year to essentially work with the science teacher at Berkeley Elementary School to try to get this into our classes. You know, we tweet. You know, we would love to do that, but we've just found it really hard to work with teachers. If anyone has any advice on how to do that better. Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.